Welcome to Warhammer 40k 8th edition, Battle Report number 11, which will be Battle Report number 6 within Group 4. 1850 points, Chaos Demons of Khorne versus Tzeentch. This will be the chapter-approved Maelstrom of War mission, Race to Victory, and we will be rolling for a random deployment map today. Let's first take a quick pan around the board to see what the terrain's going to look like and to see where the objectives have been placed. And now we'll take a look at where the objective markers have been placed, starting with this 2-foot by 2-foot section and working our way clockwise around the board, back to where we started the pan around the board to see where the terrain was. So first we have objective marker 5, objective marker 4, objective marker 6, objective marker 2, objective marker 1, and finally objective marker 3. Before we roll for anything else, we first need to roll for the D3 extra command points that the Tzeentch army will have in this battle. This is the dice we'll be rolling. The symbol is a 6. And here's the D3, getting just one additional command point, and so both sides will have 7 command points in this battle. And so now we will roll for the deployment map that the armies will be playing on today. And here's the roll, getting a 4, which is Hammer and Anvil. So on a 1, 2, or a 3, the Chaos Demons of Khorne will begin setting up on the near side, and Tzeentch will deploy on the far side. On a 4, 5, or 6, they will deploy on the opposite sides. And here's the roll, getting a 6. So Tzeentch will deploy on the near side, and the Chaos Demons of Khorne will deploy on the far side. And now on a 1, 2, or 3, Chaos Demons of Khorne will begin deploying first, and on a 4, 5, or 6, Tzeentch will begin deploying first. And it's a 2, so Chaos Demons of Khorne will begin deploying first. We will be back after the deployment. So the deployment is now finished. Chaos Demons of Khorne began setting up first, but Tzeentch finished deploying first. So unless the Chaos Demons of Khorne seize the initiative, Tzeentch will go first. Taking a look at where the models have been placed, starting with the Tzeentch deployment, we have the Lord of Change with Baleful Sword and the Impossible Robe, the first squad of Pink Horrors sitting on objective marker 2, the second squad of Pink Horrors. This squad has the demonic icon and the instrument, Soul Grinder number 1, Soul Grinder number 2, Magnus the Red, the third squad of Pink Horrors sitting on objective marker 6, and finally the Warlord Kairos Fateweaver. Then moving over to the Chaos Demon of Khorne deployment, starting across the board from the Lord of Change with Baleful Sword, we have Skull Cannon number 1, Skull Cannon number 2, the Demon Prince of Khorne with the artifact Skull Reaver, the first Bloodthirster of Insensate Rage, the first squad of Bloodletters, the 1 squad of 8 Fleshhounds, the third Skull Cannon, the second squad of Bloodletters, the second Bloodthirster of Insensate Rage, the Warlord Scarbrand, and finally the third squad of Bloodletters. The Chaos Demons of Khorne will now attempt to seize the initiative, and they successfully seize. So let's go into Chaos Demons of Khorne, turn 1. A reminder at the beginning of Chaos Demons of Khorne, turn 1, that the Chaos Demons of Khorne have 7 command points, and Tzeentch also has 7 command points. The Chaos Demons of Khorne will start by drawing 3 tactical objective cards, and they draw Secure Objective 6, score 1 victory point if you control objective marker 6 at the end of your turn. Defend objective 3, score 2 victory points if you control objective marker 3 at the end of 2 consecutive turns. And secure objective 2, score 1 victory point if you control objective marker 2 at the end of your turn. So objective marker 6 is this one right here, currently being held by a squad of Pink Horrors. Objective marker 3 is this one right here, currently being held by a Skull Cannon. And objective marker 2 is this one right here, currently being held by a different squad of Pink Horrors. So now going into the movement phase, the Chaos Demons of Khorne will start by having both of these Skull Cannons remaining still. Next, this Demon Prince of Khorne is going to move up the board 12 inches. And the Demon Prince of Khorne will finish his movement right here. Now this squad of Bloodletters is going to move towards the camera 6 inches, and they will also declare an advance. And here's their advance roll, getting an additional 6 inches for 12 inches of total movement. And the Bloodletters will finish their movement right here behind the Demon Prince of Khorne. Now this Bloodthirster of Insensate Rage is going to jump over this wall and move up the board 12 inches. And the Bloodthirster will finish his movement here, facing away from Tzeentch because otherwise his wings won't fit with the building. This squad of Fleshhounds is going to move up the board 10 inches, and they will also declare an advance. And here's their advance roll, getting 1 additional inch for 11 inches of total movement. And the Fleshhounds will finish their movement right here. This final Skull Cannon will remain still. This squad of Bloodletters is going to move up the board 6 inches, and they will also declare an advance. And here's their advance roll, getting 3 additional inches for 9 inches of total movement. And they will finish their movement right here. Now this Bloodthirster is going to jump up the board 12 inches. And the Bloodthirster will finish its movement right here. Next, these Bloodletters will move up the board 6 inches, and they will also declare an advance. And here's their advance roll, getting an additional 2 inches for 8 inches of total movement. And the Bloodletters will finish their movement right here. Finally, Skarbrand is going to move up the board 8 inches, and he will also declare an advance. And here is Skarbrand's advance roll, getting an additional 4 inches for 12 inches of total movement. And Skarbrand will finish his movement right here. So going into the shooting phase for Chaos Demons of Khorne turn 1, all 3 Skull Cannons can see and are in range of this blue Soul Grinder, so they will all shoot at that Soul Grinder, going from left to right from the camera's perspective. So starting with the first Soul Grinder, D6 shots, getting 3 shots. Hitting on 3s, getting 2 hits. Wounding on 2s, getting 2 wounds. 2 4-up invulnerable saves, and fails both. 2 D3 damage, and it will do 3 damage. So this Soul Grinder will go from 14 starting wounds down to 11. So now the second Skull Cannon, D6 shots, getting 6 shots. Hitting on 3s, and only getting 1 hit. Wounding on a 3, and it wounds. 1 4-up invulnerable save, which passes. And so now the third and final Skull Cannon, D6 shots, getting 5 shots. Hitting on 3s, getting 2 hits. Wounding on 3s, getting 2 wounds. 2 4-up invulnerable saves, passes 1 and fails 1. And D3 damage, it will do 1 damage. And so this Soul Grinder will fall from 11 wounds down to 10. And that is it for the shooting phase. So going into the assault phase, there are no charges to declare. So going into the fight phase, there are no fights to resolve. And the only unit that took damage was a Soul Grinder, which does not have to take morale checks because it's a 1 model unit. So that will be the end of Chaos Demons of Khorne turn 1. So taking a look at the tactical objective cards, they failed to secure objective 6, because that's in the Tzeentch deployment zone. They are now 1 turn into defending objective 3, and they failed to secure objective 2, since that's also in the Tzeentch deployment zone. So at this point, they will throw away secure objective 2, but they will hold on to defend objective 3 and secure objective 6 for now. So at the end of Chaos Demons of Khorne turn 1, the score currently sits at 0 victory points for the Chaos Demons of Khorne and 0 victory points for Tzeentch. So going into Tzeentch turn 1, a reminder that Tzeentch still has 7 command points, and the Chaos Demons of Khorne still have 7 command points. So at the beginning of the turn, Tzeentch started by drawing 3 new tactical objective cards, and they drew Secure Objective 6, score 1 victory point if you control Objective Marker 6 at the end of your turn. Domination, score D3 plus 3 victory points if you control every objective marker on the battlefield at the end of your turn. And Priority Orders Received. When this tactical objective is generated, immediately generate a bonus tactical objective. This does not count towards the number of active tactical objectives you currently have in play. Your Warlord is the only unit that can be used to achieve this bonus tactical objective. They must be the only unit used to control an objective marker, the unit that destroys the last model in an enemy unit, and so on. If you achieve this, you score both the number of victory points stated on the bonus tactical objective, and an additional 3 victory points. If this tactical objective is discarded, so too is the bonus tactical objective. And the bonus card is Assassinate. Score 1 victory point if at least 1 enemy character was destroyed during this turn. If 3 or more enemy characters were destroyed during this turn, score D3 victory points instead. So unless somehow Kairos Fateweaver can assassinate 3 characters on his own within a single turn, it will be impossible to get the D3 victory points for that. But Kairos might be able to put the final wound onto a character and score 1 victory point. And objective marker 6 is this one right here, currently being held by a squad of Pink Horrors. So going into the movement phase, this squad of Pink Horrors will remain still, and this squad of Pink Horrors will remain still. This Lord of Change is going to jump up and over this wall 12 inches. And the Lord of Change will finish its movement right here. This Soul Grinder is going to move up the board 8 inches, and it will finish its movement right here. This squad of Pink Horrors is going to move 6 inches over this direction to be behind the Soul Grinder, and they will finish their movement right here. And now this Soul Grinder will move up the board 8 inches, and it will finish its movement here. Now Magnus the Red is going to jump up the board 16 inches. And Magnus will finish his movement here, just over an inch away from Scarbrand, the Bloodletters, and the Bloodthirster, but being a little closer to Scarbrand. And then finally, Kairos Fateweaver is going to jump up and over this wall 12 inches to the other side to be closer to the Chaos Demons of Khorne. And Kairos will finish his movement here, just over 2 inches away from the Bloodthirster. Going into the Psychic phase, we will start with this Lord of Change, which is going to cast Boon of Change onto this Soul Grinder, and he will cast Smite onto the Demon Prince of Khorne, since it's the closest visible enemy unit. Starting with Boon of Change onto the Soul Grinder, which needs a 7, and he gets it with an 11. The Fleshhounds will attempt to deny the Witch, and they fail to do so. So rolling a D3 for the table, getting a 1, which is extra limbs. The Soul Grinder will have +1 to its attack characteristic until the start of the next Tzeentch Psychic phase. And so now casting Smite onto the Demon Prince, and he gets it with a 10. So D3 mortal wounds, and it will do 3 mortal wounds. And so this Demon Prince of Khorne with Skull Reaver will go from 8 starting wounds down to 5. Next, this squad of Pink Horrors is going to attempt to manifest Smite, and the closest visible enemy unit is actually these Fleshhounds. So looking for a 5 or 6, and fails to get it. So now Kairos Fateweaver is going to attempt to manifest Gaze of Fate. He will attempt to manifest Smite onto this Bloodthirster, since it's the closest visible enemy unit, and he will also attempt to manifest Bolt of Change onto Scarbrand. Starting with Gaze of Fate, which needs a 6, and he gets it with a 9. So Tzeentch will be able to re-roll 1 dice roll later this turn. Now for Smite onto the Bloodthirster, needing a 5, and he gets it with a 9. And it will cause D3 mortal wounds, and it will cause 3 mortal wounds. So this Bloodthirster will drop from 16 starting wounds down to 13. And now he will cast Bolt of Change into Scarbrand, which has a warp charge value of 8, and he passes with a 9. And it will do D3 mortal wounds, and it will do 2 mortal wounds. And so the Warlord Scarbrand will drop from 16 starting wounds down to 14. And so then finally, Magnus the Red is going to cast Diabolic Strength onto himself. He will cast Death Hex onto the Bloodthirster of Insensate Rage, and he will cast Smite into Scarbrand, since Scarbrand is the closest visible enemy unit. So starting with Smite, getting an 8, so it goes off. And thanks to the Gaze of Magnus, it will cast D6 mortal wounds, and will do 4 mortal wounds onto Scarbrand. So Scarbrand will drop from 14 wounds down to 10. So now he will cast Diabolic Strength onto himself, which needs a 6, and he gets it with a 12. And so now Magnus will have +2 to his Strength characteristic and +1 to his Attack characteristic. And finally, he will cast Death Hex onto the Bloodthirster, which needs an 8, and he gets it with a 9. So the Bloodthirster will not be able to take invulnerable saves this turn. And so now going into the shooting phase, we will have this Soul Grinder shoot everything it has into Scarbrand. And the Soul Grinder did move, of course, so he will have -1 to his ballistic skill. I should say he will be subtracting 1 from hit rolls, which is slightly different from -1 to ballistic skill. So starting with the Harvester Cannon, 3 shots hitting on 5s and getting 1 hit. Wounding on a 4, and it wounds. Skarbrand will have a 4-up armor save, which he fails. And this will do D3 damage, and it will do 3 damage. So Skarbrand will go from 10 wounds down to 7. And so now the Phlegm Bombardment will do D6 shots, getting 4 shots. Hitting on 5s, getting 1 hit. Wounding on a 3, and it wounds. 1 5-up invulnerable save, which fails. And it has a damage characteristic of 3, so Skarbrand will go from 7 wounds down to 4 left. And so now the other Soul Grinder will also shoot everything it has into Skarbrand. Starting with the Harvester Cannon, 3 shots hitting on 5s, getting 1 hit. Wounding on a 4, fails to wound. So now the Phlegm Bombardment, D6 shots, getting 6 shots. Hitting on 5s, getting 1 hit. Wounding on a 3, and it fails to wound. So then finally, this entire Pink Horror squad is within 18 inches and can see this Bloodthirster, so they will all shoot into him. 20 shots hitting on 4s, getting 11 hits. Wounding on 6s, getting 1 wound. 1 3-up armor save, which passes. So now going into the assault phase, there are 4 charges to declare. The first of which is Kairos Fateweaver will declare a charge into the Bloodthirster of Insensate Rage. The second is Magnus the Red will declare a multi-charge into Skarbrand and the Bloodthirster of Insensate Rage, with the Bloodthirster being the primary target. Third will be the Soul Grinder. The blue Soul Grinder will declare a charge into the Fleshhounds. And finally, the Silver Soul Grinder will declare a charge into this Bloodthirster of Insensate Rage. And there is actually a 5th charge to declare, which will be the Lord of Change, declaring a charge into the Demon Prince. And we will start with Magnus because Skarbrand is the only one with Overwatch. So D6 shots from the Bellow of Endless Fury, getting 5 shots. This weapon automatically hits, so 5 hits. Strength 5 versus Toughness 7 means 5s to wound and getting 1 wound. 1 4-up invulnerable save, which fails. And so Magnus the Red will go from 18 starting wounds down to 17. However, because he's just over an inch away from both Skarbrand and the Bloodthirster, and he's not charging through a crater, he will automatically make it in. And so Magnus is now in combat with both. Kairos Fateweaver, since he's also just over 2 inches away, cannot fail his charge since he is not charging through a crater, so Kairos will automatically make it in. And so Kairos Fateweaver is now in combat. Now we will do the charge distance for the Soul Grinder attacking the Fleshhounds because he is charging through a crater, so subtracting 2 from this roll, which gives him 8 inches, which is actually 6 inches. But luckily for the Soul Grinder, he was only about 4.5 inches away, so that will be more than enough for him to make it in. Now for the Lord of Change charging into the Demon Prince of Khorne, and that will fail. The Lord of Change is just over 4 inches away, which means he needed to roll a 4-inch charge in order to make it into combat. So Tzeentch is going to use one of their command points for a command reroll in order to reroll one of the ones. And here's the reroll, which will give them enough to make it in. And so now the Lord of Change will be in combat with the Demon Prince. And so finally then the Silver Soul Grinder will charge into the Bloodthirster, getting 7 inches. And the Silver Soul Grinder is just under 8 inches away, which means 7 inches will be enough to put him within an inch of the Bloodthirster. And so he will be in combat. So going into the fight phase, we will start with Kairos Fateweaver attacking the Bloodthirster of Insensate Rage. Since Kairos is still at full wounds, he has 5 attacks base plus 1 attack for being within 8 inches of Skarbrand, and so he has 6 attacks total, and he will be using the Staff of Tomorrow. So 6 attacks onto the Bloodthirster, hitting on 3s, and getting 4 hits. Wounding on 3s, getting 3 wounds. And Tzeentch is going to use 1 command dice, 1 command point, for 1 command reroll, now that it's a different phase, in order to reroll the 2. So looking for another 3-up, and they get it. So getting 4 wounds. The Staff of Tomorrow has an AP of -3, so the Bloodthirster will take 4 6-up armor saves, and does pass 1. But this does d6 damage apiece, and only does 7 damage. And Tzeentch is going to use their 1 reroll from Gaze of Fate to reroll that 1, because it can't be any worse than that. So here's the reroll, getting 6 damage, so getting a total of 12 damage. Which unfortunately does mean for Tzeentch that Bloodthirster will not be killed by Kairos Fateweaver this turn. Since it has 13 wounds left, 12 damage will take it from 13 wounds down to 1 left. So now that Kairos Fateweaver is done fighting, the Chaos Demons of Khorne are going to use the stratagem Counteroffensive for 2 command points, which will bring them from 7 command points down to 5. This stratagem is used right after an enemy unit that charged has fought. Select one of your own eligible units and fight with it next. And the Chaos Demons of Khorne are going to fight with Skarbrand attacking Magnus. So Skarbrand attacking Magnus, since he's down to 4 wounds, he has 8 attacks base, but is reduced to a 4-up weapon skill. So he has 8 attacks base, +1 for being charged, and +1 for being within 8 inches of himself, for 10 attacks total. So Skarbrand will use all 10 attacks on Magnus in Mighty Strike form, so that he can reroll failed hit rolls with this weapon. So 10 attacks, hitting on 4s. Getting 4 hits and 6 misses, but re-rolling the misses. And here's the re-rolls, getting 2 additional hits. However, he did roll 3 6s, which generate additional hits. So getting 9 hits out of 10 attacks, wounding on 2s, and getting 8 wounds. 8 4-up invulnerable saves, and passes 7 of them. What? Wow. Oh, that's bad for Khorne, because it will, no matter what they roll for the damage now, it will be impossible to drop Magnus. Skarbrand will not be able to drop Magnus from his highest tier, so he'll still have his max number of attacks. So the 1 wound that goes through will do d6 damage, and it'll do 6 damage. Way to make the most of it, Skarbrand. So that will take Magnus from 17 wounds down to 11. And so now Magnus is going to attack back, and because he still has 11 wounds, he has 7 attacks base, +1 for Diabolic Strength, and +1 for being within 8 inches of Skarbrand for 9 attacks total. And he will place 3 attacks onto the Bloodthirster of Insensate Rage with the Blade of Magnus, and he will place the other 6 attacks onto Skarbrand with the Blade of Magnus. So starting with the 3 attacks onto the Bloodthirster, hitting on 2s, re-rolling 1s thanks to himself, getting 2 hits and 1 re-roll. And here's the re-roll, getting 3 hits. Strength 20 this turn versus Toughness 7 means 2s to wound. And getting 3 wounds, and it's -4 AP, so the Bloodthirster won't get an armor save, and he's been death hexed, so he can't take invulns. And it does an automatic 3 damage each. So that will be 9 damage onto the Bloodthirster, which only has 1 wound left. And so with 8 points of overkill, this Bloodthirster is killed off for first blood. And so now the 6 attacks onto Skarbrand, hitting on 2s, getting 4 hits with 2 rerolls. And here's the 2 rerolls, still getting a miss, but getting 5 hits. Strength 20 versus Toughness 7 is 2s to wound and getting 4 wounds. 4 5-up invulnerable saves. And he passes 1, failing 2, and while Chaos Demons of Khorne could use a command point to re-roll one of those dice, that would guarantee that 2 pass, and it does an automatic 3 damage apiece, which will finish off Skarbrand, so they will not use a command point here. And so, with only 4 wounds left, 9 points of damage will mean 5 points of overkill, and so Skarbrand will be killed off. And before I forget, Kairos Fateweaver is going to choose not to consolidate this turn, but Magnus the Red is going to consolidate into the Bloodletters, which means those Bloodletters will be able to attack this turn. So now we will resolve the Lord of Change against the Demon Prince of Khorne. The Lord of Change is still at full wounds, so he has 5 attack space, and he will use all 5 with the Baleful Sword onto the Demon Prince, so hitting on 3s. And only getting 1 hit. That is awful. Wounding on a 3, and it wounds. Demon Prince has a 5-up invulnerable save, which it fails. And d6 damage. which will do 3 damage. And so the Demon Prince will go from 5 wounds left down to 2. So now the Silver Soul Grinder onto the Bloodthirster. It was booned this turn, so it has +1 attack, and since it's at full wounds with 5 attacks base, means it will have 6 attacks total this turn, and it will use its Iron Claw. So 6 attacks hitting on 4s, getting 4 hits. Strength 16 versus Toughness 7 means 2s to wound and getting 4 wounds. 4 5-up invulnerable saves, passes 2 and fails 2. These do d6 damage apiece for a total of 5 damage. And so the Bloodthirster will drop from 16 starting wounds down to 11. And so then finally the Soul Grinder, attacking the Flesh Hounds, still has 10 wounds left, so he has 5 attacks base. And he will use the Warp Sword so that he can reroll failed hit rolls. So 5 attacks hitting on 4s. Getting 4 hits in 1 reroll, and here's the reroll, getting 5 hits. Wounding on 2s, getting 4 wounds. 4 5-up invulnerable saves, and they fail all 4. And the Warp Sword does an automatic 3 damage apiece, which means that 4 Flesh Hounds will automatically be killed off since they only have 2 wounds apiece. And so now the Flesh Hounds will pile in, and the 4 remaining Flesh Hounds will fight back. 3 attacks apiece for 12 attacks total, since they were charged, hitting on 3s, getting 9 hits, wounding on 5s, and so getting 6 wounds, which is pretty good. 6 4-up invulnerable saves, and he passes 4 of them, failing 2. So the Soul Grinder will go from 10 remaining wounds down to 8. And now these Bloodletters will pile in. And so now that they're all in combat, they will all fight back. Since that entire squad is still alive, 21 attacks since they were charged, hitting on 3s, and getting 15 hits, wounding on 5s, getting 5 wounds with 1 of them doing double damage. So a 4-up invuln against the double damage, which passes, and 4 4-up invulns against the single damage, passing 3, only failing 1. And so Magnus will lose 1 wound, going from 11 down to 10. Now the Demon Prince of Khorne with Skull Reaver will attack back against the Lord of Change. So since it was charged, the Demon Prince will have 6 attacks with the Skull Reaver, plus 1 additional attack from its Malefic Talon. So 6 attacks hitting on 2s, rerolling 1s thanks to himself, getting 5 hits, and 1 reroll, getting an additional hit for 6 hits total. Strength 11 versus Toughness 7 means 3s to wound and getting 3 wounds. However, one of them was a 6, so that causes an automatic D3 mortal wounds. And so here's the D3 mortal wounds, causing just 1 mortal wound. And the Chaos Demons of Khorne are going to use 1 command point for a command reroll in order to reroll the automatic mortal wounds. So hoping for something bigger this time, and it causes 3 mortal wounds. So this means that the Lord of Change will drop from 16 starting wounds down to 13. And so now the Lord of Change will take 3 3-up invulnerable saves, and it passes all 3. So it will definitely survive. So finally, the last thing that needs to attack back is the Bloodthirster, which still has 11 wounds. And so the Bloodthirster will have 6 attacks base, plus 1 for being charged, and it will use the Mighty Strike form from his Great Axe of Khorne. And he is within 6 inches of the Demon Prince of Khorne. So, 7 attacks, hitting on 2s, rerolling 1s thanks to the Demon Prince. With 2 rerolls, getting 1 additional hit. But in total, he did roll 2 6s, which generate additional free hits. So a total of 8 hits out of 7 attacks. Strength 16 versus Toughness 7 means 2s to wound, and getting 7 wounds. 7 4-up invulnerable saves. Passes 2 and fails 5. And so each of the 5 strikes does d6 damage, but rolling 2 dice, taking the highest. So strike number 1 will do 3 damage. Strike number 2 will also do 3 damage. Strike number 3 will do 6 damage. Strike number 4 will do 4 damage. And that's already more than enough to kill the Soul Grinder, but strike number 5 will do 4 damage as well. So that will do a grand total of 20 damage. And Soul Grinders only have 14 wounds base, so this Soul Grinder is killed off. And so finally, this Bloodthirster will consolidate a couple inches up the board. Right to there. And so now that the fight phase is over, the Chaos Demons of Khorne will use 3 command points, going from 4 command points down to 1 left, in order to use the stratagem Frenetic Bloodlust. Use this stratagem at the end of any fight phase. Select one of your Khorne demon units. That unit can immediately fight again. And so the unit that will fight again will be this Demon Prince of Khorne onto the Lord of Change. And before I forget, I think I forgot the Malefic Talon attack from last time. And so I will just do that Malefic Talon attack with the new Malefic Talon attack from this fight. So 2 Malefic Talon attacks, hitting on 2s, re-rolling the 1, getting 2 hits, wounding on 3s, getting 2 wounds, 2 3-up invulnerable saves, and passes both, so that would not matter. Which means the only thing left is the 6 new attacks from Skull Reaver, hitting on 2s, re-rolling 1s, and getting 3 1s. So 3 re-rolls, and all hit. Wounding on 3s, and only getting 3 wounds, no automatic mortal wounds. So 3 3-up invulnerable saves, and passes 2, failing 1. And the Lord of Change is going to take a risk using the 1 Impossible Rogue reroll, and is slain! Oh, why? Why? Minor spoiler alert, but this means that both times, the only 2 times I've attempted the Impossible Rogue reroll, it's resulted in a 1. Oh my goodness, that is... that's something right there, let me tell you. So, good job, Demon Prince of Khorne. You caused the Lord of Change to kill itself. And so the Demon Prince of Khorne will consolidate forward a couple of inches. So, going into the morale phase, the only unit that needs to take a morale test is the Fleshhounds, but they are within 8 inches of the Bloodthirster of Insensate Rage, so they can use its leadership. And I should say within 6 inches, not 8 inches, because the Greater Demon Rule says within 6 inches, but they are within 6 inches. They're actually only about 3.5 to 4 inches away, so they're definitely within. But that also means, of course, that since the Bloodthirster has a leadership of 10 and they only lost 4 models, it is impossible for them to fail that morale check. And so they don't actually have to take the morale check. Taking a look at the tactical objective cards, Tzeentch did secure Objective 6 for 1 victory point. They did not complete Domination. And, thanks to that Bloodthirster surviving Kairos' attacks with 1 wound left, they failed to complete Priority Orders Received, Assassinate. So Tzeentch will throw away Domination and hold on to Priority Orders Received, although that is actually not impossible to achieve still. Could possibly achieve that because both the Bloodthirster and the Demon Prince of Khorne, the other Bloodthirster and the Demon Prince of Khorne, managed to survive this turn unexpectedly. So they will hold on to that. So, at the end of Tzeentch turn 1, the score currently sits at 3 victory points for Tzeentch and 0 victory points for the Chaos Demons of Khorne. So going into Chaos Demons of Khorne, turn 2, a reminder that the Chaos Demons of Khorne have 1 command point left, and Tzeentch has 5 command points left. Also a reminder that from the previous turn, Chaos Demons of Khorne held on to secure Objective 6 and defend Objective 3. And Objective Marker 6 is this one right here, currently being held by these pink horrors, which was also the same tactical objective that Tzeentch completed in Tzeentch turn 1. And Objective Marker 3 is this one right here, currently being held by a Skull Cannon, and they are 1 turn into defending it, so they will complete that at the end of this turn as long as the Skull Cannons don't move off of it, which they won't. But Khorne did have to draw 1 new tactical objective card, and so they draw Secure Objective 1. Score 1 victory point if you control Objective Marker 1 at the end of your turn. And Objective Marker 1 is this one right here. So going into the movement phase, we will start by having both of these Skull Cannons remain still. And also this Skull Cannon will remain still. This squad of Fleshhounds will remain locked in combat with the Soul Grinder. And this squad of Bloodletters will remain locked in combat with Magnus the Red. So first, the Chaos Demons of Khorne will have this squad of Bloodletters move up the board 6 inches. And so they will end up right here, just over an inch away from Kairos Fateweaver. Now this Demon Prince of Khorne is going to move 12 inches over towards the Soul Grinder. and the Demon Prince will finish its movement here. Now this Bloodthirster with 11 wounds left is going to move up the board towards the Pink Horrors, and it will finish its movement right here. And now this squad of Bloodletters is going to move up the board 6 inches, and they will also declare an advance. And here's their advance roll, getting 6 inches for a 12-inch total movement. And so they finish their movement right here, and since they are a troop choice, they are undeniably holding and controlling objective marker 1. So now going into the shooting phase, both of these skull cannons are going to fire, starting with the left one, into this squad of Pink Horrors right in front of the Bloodthirster. So the first skull cannon doing D6 shots, getting 1 shot. Hitting on a 3, and it hits. Wounding on a 2, and it wounds. 1 4-up invulnerable save, which fails. And so 1 Pink Horror will go down. Now the second skull cannon, D6 shots, getting 6 shots. Hitting on 3s, getting 3 hits. Wounding on 2s, getting 3 wounds. 3 4-up invulnerable saves, and they pass all 3. Alright then. And so then the final skull cannon, which also did not move, will fire into Kairos Fateweaver. D6 shots, getting 4 shots. Hitting on 3s, getting 2 hits. Wounding on 3s, and failing to wound. So now going into the assault phase, there are 3 charges to declare. The first is this squad of Bloodletters declaring a charge into Kairos Fateweaver. The second is this Demon Prince of Khorne declaring a charge into the Soulgrinder. And the third and final charge is the Bloodthirster declaring a charge into these Pink Horrors. And we will resolve this charge first, since this is the only group that can Overwatch this turn. So since one of the Pink Horrors died earlier this turn, there's only 18 shots worth of Overwatch, hitting on 6s and getting 4 6s, wounding on 6s, and failing to wound. And the charge distance, more than enough. And so the Bloodthirster with 11 wounds will now be in combat. Next, the Demon Prince will charge into the Soulgrinder. And the charge distance, more than enough. And the Demon Prince with 2 wounds left will be in combat. And so then finally, the charge from these Bloodletters into Kairos Fateweaver. And the charge distance getting 7 inches. And so here's where they ended up, and they will all be in combat. So the first thing that's going to happen going into the fight phase is that Tzeentch is going to use 2 command points going from 5 down to 3 in order to use the stratagem Warp Surge. Use this stratagem at the start of any phase, select a unit of demons until the end of the phase. You cannot re-roll saving throws for this unit, but its invulnerable save is improved by 1 to a maximum of 3 up. And the unit that will be affected will be this group of 9 Pink Horrors. So they will have a 3-up invulnerable save. And so now the first charging unit that will fight will be the Demon Prince of Khorne onto the Soulgrinder. Starting with the 6 attacks on the charge, with the Skull Reaver hitting on 2s, re-rolling 1s thanks to himself, getting 4 hits and 2 re-rolls, all 6 hit, wounding on 3s, getting only 3 wounds, but one of them will also cause automatic mortal wounds. So D3 automatic mortal wounds, only causing 1. And so the Chaos Demons of Khorne are going to use their last command point, going from 1 down to 0 in order to re-roll that, since it can't get any worse, and so now it does 3 mortal wounds. And so this Soulgrinder will drop from 8 wounds down to 5. And that reminded me that I had forgotten to roll to see if the previous Soulgrinder would have exploded, and it would not have. So I do apologize for forgetting it at the time, but the fully silver Soulgrinder did not explode. So now on the blue Soulgrinder, 3 4-up invulnerable saves, and he passes all 3. And that's why we re-rolled those mortal wounds, because now that Soulgrinder is going to potentially survive. And so then finally, the Malefic Talon attack, 1 attack, hitting on a 2, of course it misses, but getting a reroll thanks to himself, and it hits. Wounding on a 3, and it wounds. 4-up invulnerable save, which it fails, and it will do 2 damage. And so the Soulgrinder will go from 5 wounds down to 3. And so now Tzeentch is going to go and use 2 command points, going from 3 down to 1 left, to use the stratagem Counteroffensive. This stratagem is used right after an enemy unit that charged is fought. Select one of your own eligible units and fight with it next. And so the Soul Grinder will be the subject of that, and it will attack back onto the Demon Prince. So now that it's down to 3 wounds, it only has D3 base attacks. So here's the D3. Getting 1 attack. However, Tzeentch will use their last command point for a command reroll, going from 1 command point down to 0 in order to reroll that. As it can't get worse, still only getting 1 attack, of course. So 1 attack with its Warp Sword, hitting on a 4. Fails to hit, but getting a reroll thanks to the Warp Sword. So here's the reroll, and it still fails to hit. Ouch. So now the Bloodthirster is going to attack the Pink Horrors. And the Bloodthirster, which still has 11 wounds, has 6 attacks base plus 1 for charging, so 7 attacks total, but it's going to use the Sweeping Blow form of Great Axe of Khorne, so it gets to make 2 hit rolls instead of 1 for each attack made with this weapon. So 14 attacks total. Onto the Pink Horrors, hitting on 2s, re-rolling 1 since he's still within 6 inches of the Demon Prince, and getting 12 hits so far. And here's the 2 rerolls, getting 2 more hits, and there's also 4 6s in there. So that will generate an additional 4 automatic hits, which means the Bloodthirster gets 18 hits out of 14 attacks. Wounding on 2s, no rerolls, and only getting 1-1. So that is 17 wounds. 17 3-up invulnerable saves, and only fails 4. Wow. Thanks to that stratagem Warp Surge, that caused 4 additional saved invulns. So without that stratagem, we'd be talking about 8 dead Pink Horrors instead of only 4. But still, wow. And so just 4 Pink Horrors will be killed off. So finally, the last unit that charged will be this squad of Bloodletters onto Kairos Fateweaver. 21 attacks on the charge, hitting on 3s, and getting 12 hits. Wounding on 5s, getting 4 wounds with one of them doing double damage. So 1 4-up invuln against the double damage, which will go through, and 3 4-up invulns against the single damage, and one of those will go through. So doing a total of 3 damage onto Kairos Fateweaver, which will drop him from 16 starting wounds down to 13. And so now going into units that did not charge this turn, starting with this squad of Bloodletters. Only 11 attacks from this squad since they did not charge and were not charged this turn. Hitting on 3s, getting 8 hits. Wounding on 5s, getting 3 double damage wounds. So 3 4-up invulnerable saves, and fails 1, which means that Magnus will drop from 10 wounds down to 8. And now Magnus will strike back. And so now Magnus is down to only 6 attacks base, hitting on 2s re-rolling, getting 6 hits. Wounding on 2s, getting 5 wounds. 5 5-up invulnerable saves, and they fail all 5. And so 5 Bloodletters will be killed off. So now the 4 Fleshhounds will get to attack the Soul Grinder. Only 8 attacks, hitting on 3s but re-rolling 1s for being within 6 inches of the Demon Prince of Khorne. And getting 6 hits and 2 re-rolls. So the 2 re-rolls, getting 1 more hit. So 7 hits, wounding on 5s, and getting 3 wounds. 3 4-up invulnerable saves, and he fails 2 but passes 1. And they are only 1 damage apiece, which means the Soul Grinder goes from 3 wounds down to 1 left and will survive this turn. So now Kairos Fateweaver will fight back against the Bloodletters. Kairos Fateweaver has 13 wounds left, so he has 5 attacks base with his Staff of Tomorrow, hitting on 3s and getting 5 hits. Wounding on 2s, getting 4 wounds. 4 5-up invulnerable saves. And they pass all 4. Okay. So no Bloodletters are killed off from that squad. And so then finally this Pink Horror squad will fight back against the Bloodthirster. 6 attacks, hitting on 4s, getting 3 hits. Wounding on 6s, getting 1 wound. One 3-up armor save, which the Bloodthirster fails. And so the Bloodthirster will go from 11 wounds down to 10. And that is finally the end of this fight phase. So going into the morale phase, there are 2 units that need to take morale tests this turn. The first of which is this squad of Bloodletters, which lost 5 models this turn and is not within 6 inches of any monstrous creatures with the greater demon ability. And they have a leadership of 7, and they fail by 4. So 1 model will remain, which will be the Blood Reaper. So the only model left from this Bloodletter squad is the Blood Reaper, who will be locked in combat with Magnus the Red. And then finally, the only other squad that needs to take a morale test this turn is this squad of Pink Horrors, which also lost 5 models this turn. However, thanks to their demonic icon, if they roll a 1 on their morale test, reality blinks, and not only will they not risk losing any models, although a 1 wouldn't lose models anyways, a 1 or a 2 wouldn't lose any models, but they get D6 slain Pink Horrors back. And Tzeentch has no command points, so they can't reroll this, so here's their morale test, and they get a 3, so they lose 1 more model. So 1 more regular Pink Horror will go down. So now taking a quick look at the tactical objective cards, Chaos Daemons of Khorne did not secure objective 6, so they will throw that one away. However, they have now finished defending objective 3, so that will get them 2 victory points. And also, they have secured objective 1 for 1 victory point. And so at the end of Chaos Daemons of Khorne, turn 2, the score currently sits at 3 victory points for the Chaos Daemons of Khorne and 3 victory points for Tzeentch. Going into Tzeentch turn 2, a reminder that Tzeentch has 0 command points left and the Chaos Daemons of Khorne have 0 command points left. Also a reminder that Tzeentch held on to priorities orders received Assassinate from the previous turn, and so they draw 2 new tactical objective cards, and they draw Overwhelming Firepower, score 1 victory point if an enemy unit was destroyed during the shooting phase of your turn. If 3 or more enemy units were destroyed during the shooting phase of your turn, score D3 victory points instead. And Defend Objective 3, score 2 victory points if you control Objective Marker 3 at the end of 2 consecutive turns. And Objective Marker 3 is this one right here, in the Chaos Daemons of Khorne deployment zone that the Chaos Daemons of Khorne just finished defending themselves. So very unlikely to get that one. So going into the movement phase, Tzeentch will start by having this squad of Pink Horrors move up the board 6 inches, and they will also declare an advance. And so here's their advance roll, getting an additional 4 inches for 10 inches of total movement. And so here's where these Pink Horrors ended up, and they are closest to the Demon Prince for the purposes of Smite. Next, Kairos Fateweaver will remain locked in combat with these Bloodletters. Magnus the Red will remain locked in combat with the 1 Blood Reaper. This Soul Grinder with 1 wound left is going to fall back 4 inches out of combat. And he will now end up here out of combat. This squad of Pink Horrors is now going to fall back 6 inches out of combat. And the Pink Horrors will end up here. This squad of Pink Horrors is going to move up the board 6 inches, and they will also declare an advance. And here's their advance roll, getting 5 extra inches for 11 inches of total movement. And this unit of Pink Horrors will end up here. So going into the Psychic phase, Kairos Fateweaver is going to cast Boon of Change onto himself. He will cast Smite onto the Bloodletters that he's in combat with, and he will cast Bolt of Change onto the Blood Reaper that Magnus is in combat with. So starting with the Boon of Change onto himself, he needs a 7, and he gets it with a 13, which is impossible for the Fleshhounds to deny, so they will not attempt to. And so here's the D3 roll on the table, giving him a 2, so Kairos will have extra limb, and he'll have +1 to his attack characteristic until the start of the next Tzeentch Psychic phase. So now he will cast Smite onto the Bloodletters that he is in combat with, and he gets a 6. So it will go off, but the Fleshhounds that are within 24 inches will attempt to deny the witch, and they successfully do so it will not go off. Finally, Bolt of Change onto the 1 Blood Reaper, which will go off with a 10, because it has a warp charge value of 8. And it does D3 mortal wounds, but that doesn't matter because it's just the 1 Blood Reaper left. And so this final Blood Reaper is killed off. And this does mean that Magnus is no longer locked in combat. So now Magnus will attempt to manifest Warp Time onto himself. And Warp Time has a warp charge value of 6, and he passes with a 7, since he's now down to just +1 Psychic Phase bonus. And so now Magnus can move as if it were the movement phase. And so Magnus the Red, with his 8 wounds left, will end up over here, and he will be closest to the Bloodthirster. And so now he will cast Smite onto the Bloodthirster, needing a 5. And he gets it, thanks to his Psychic Test bonus of +1. And so because of the Gaze of Magnus, this causes D6 mortal wounds, and it will cause 5 mortal wounds. So this means the Bloodthirster will go from 10 remaining wounds down to 5. And so now Magnus the Red will cast Death Hex onto the Bloodthirster. And it has a warp charge value of 8, but he fails to get it. So that Bloodthirster will be able to take invulns this turn. So now this Pink Horror Squad, which is closest to the Demon Prince, will attempt to manifest Smite. So looking for a 5 or 6, and fails with a 4. And so now the wounded Pink Horror Squad that fell back this turn will attempt to manifest Smite onto the Bloodthirster. Looking for a 5 or 6, fails with another 4. And finally, the final Pink Horror Squad, which is still at full strength, will attempt to manifest Smite onto the Bloodthirster. Looking for a 5 or 6, fails with a 2. So moving into the shooting phase, we will start with this squad of Pink Horrors, which did advance, but the Coruscating Flames are assault weapons, so they can still fire, just subtracting 1 from the hit rolls, and they will fire into the Fleshhound, since they are all within 18 inches of the Pink Horrors. So, 20 shots, hitting on 5s, and getting 10 hits, wounding on 5s, and getting 3 wounds, 3 5-up invulnerable saves, passing 2, failing 1. So 1 Fleshhound will go down to 1 wound. And the other squad of Pink Horrors, which also advanced, can also all see and are within range of the Fleshhounds. So 20 attacks, hitting on 5s, only getting 6 hits this time. Wounding on 5s, getting 2 wounds, and 2 5-up invulnerable saves, and they fail both. So the 1 wounded Fleshhound will be removed, and 1 fully healthy Fleshhound will go down to 1 wound. So going into the assault phase, there is only 1 charge to declare, which will be Magnus charging into the Bloodthirster and the Demon Prince, with the Bloodthirster being the primary target. And here's the charge range, getting 12 inches. And so Magnus will be in combat with both, and we will resolve Magnus's attacks first. Magnus, since he is down to 8 wounds, has 6 attacks base, and so he will place 3 onto the Bloodthirster and 3 onto the Demon Prince. So starting with the 3 attacks onto the Demon Prince. 3 attacks hitting on 2s, getting 3 hits. Wounding on 2s, getting 2 wounds. And unless he passes both 5-up invulns, he is dead, and that Demon Prince will be killed off, as the Blade of Magnus does an automatic 3 damage, so the Demon Prince is removed. And now the 3 attacks onto the Bloodthirster, hitting on 2s, getting 3 hits. Wounding on 2s, getting 2 wounds. 2 5-up invulnerable saves, and passes both, and that makes a difference. The fact that Death Hex failed to go off saved that Bloodthirster's life and did not take any additional wounds. That's a big deal. That is a huge deal. So now Kairos will get to fight against the Bloodletters. Kairos is still at 13 wounds, so he has 5 attacks base, but he got +1 attack thanks to the Boon of Change, so 6 attacks total. Using the Staff of Tomorrow, attacking the Bloodletters, hitting on 3s and getting 5 hits. Wounding on 2s and getting 5 wounds. 5 5-up invulnerable saves, and they pass 2, failing 3. And so 2 regular Bloodletters will go down. And so now the Bloodletters will strike back. And I apologize, they actually failed 3 invulns and only passed 2, which means a 3rd Bloodletter will go down. So now the Bloodletters will strike back. So only 8 attacks back onto Kairos, hitting on 3s, getting 6 hits. Wounding on 5s, getting 3 wounds, 2 of them doing double damage. So the 1 single damage 4-up invuln, which passes, and 2 4-up invulns on the double damage, and he fails both of those. So this means that Kairos will go from 13 wounds down to 9. And so then finally, the Bloodthirster, which did manage to survive, will get to strike back against Magnus. And the Bloodthirster still has 5 wounds left, which means he is still at his second tier of damage, so he has 4 attacks base plus 1 for being charged. He will use all 5 in Mighty Strike form. So 5 attacks on the Magnus, hitting on 3s, getting 3 hits, wounding on 2s, getting 2 wounds, 2 4-up invulnerable saves, and Magnus passes both, which means no further wounds will be taken here and they will be locked in combat. So going into the morale phase, there are 2 units this turn that lost models, the first of which is the Fleshhounds. However, they only lost 1 full model and so therefore cannot fail their leadership of 7. However, these Bloodletters did lose 3 models this turn and so they could potentially fail a morale check. And here's the dice roll for their morale check, and of course they roll a 6, which means they fail by 2. And so 2 more Bloodletters will be removed. So now, taking a quick look at the tactical objective cards, Tzeentch failed to complete overwhelming firepower, they failed to finish defending objective 3, and they failed to complete priority orders received, assassinate. And so at this point, considering the only Chaos Demons of Khorne character left on the board is the Bloodthirster who's locked in combat with Magnus, Tzeentch is going to throw away priority orders received. But since they can only throw away 1 tactical objective card per turn, they have to hold on to overwhelming firepower and defend objective 3, even though at this point, both of those are very unlikely to be achieved. So at the end of Tzeentch turn 2, the score currently sits at 3 victory points for Tzeentch and 3 victory points for the Chaos Demons of Khorne. Going into Chaos Demons of Khorne, turn 3, Chaos Demons of Khorne need to start by drawing 3 new tactical objective cards since they cleared the board last turn. They draw Scour the Skies, score 1 victory point if at least 1 enemy unit that can fly was destroyed during this turn. Supremacy, score D3 victory points if you control any 3 objective markers at the end of your turn. And defend objective 6, score 2 victory points if you control objective marker 6 at the end of 2 consecutive turns. And once again, objective marker 6 is this one right here, within the Tzeentch deployment zone. So going into the movement phase, this Skull Cannon, currently sitting on objective 5, will remain still. This unit of Bloodletters in combat with Kairos Fateweaver will remain locked in combat. And in fact, if this Bloodletter right here on the end stays alive, he is within 3 inches of the center of objective marker 4 and therefore would be controlling it. These Fleshhounds are going to move up the board 10 inches. And the Fleshhounds will finish their movement here, and they are staying over an inch away from both the Soul Grinder and Magnus the Red. These 2 Skull Cannons, with this one sitting on objective marker 3, will both remain still. This Bloodthirster will remain locked in combat with Magnus. And finally, this squad of Bloodletters is going to move 6 inches up the board towards Magnus the Red. And the Bloodletters will finish their movement here, just over an inch away from Magnus the Red. Going into the shooting phase, we will start with this Skull Cannon, sitting on objective marker 5, and it will fire into the blue Soul Grinder, which has 1 wound left. So D6 shots, getting 3 shots. Hitting on 3s, getting 3 hits. Wounding on 3s, getting 2 wounds. 2 4-up invulnerable saves, and it fails 1. And it does D3 damage apiece, so that means that Soul Grinder will be killed off, regardless of what the D3 rolls to be. But on a 6, it explodes, and it does not. And so this Soul Grinder is removed. And so now this Soul Grinder, the one more towards the middle, sitting on objective 3, is going to fire and attempt to finish off this squad of Pink Horrors, the one that's down to 4 models. So D6 shots, doing 4 shots. Hitting on 3s, getting 3 hits. Wounding on 2s, getting 3 wounds. 3 4-up invulnerable saves, and they fail 2, passing 1. And so the final regular Pink Horror and the one with the instrument are removed. And then finally, the final Skull Cannon will shoot the same Pink Horror squad. So D6 shots, doing 3 shots. Hitting on 3s, only getting 1 hit. Wounding on a 2, and it wounds. 1 4-up invulnerable save, which passes. So now, going into the assault phase, there are 2 charges to declare. The first is this squad of Bloodletters will declare a charge onto Magnus the Red, and the second charge is these Fleshhounds will declare a multi-charge onto Magnus the Red and the Pink Horrors, with the primary target being Magnus the Red. So starting with the Fleshhounds and their charge, which also means 4 shots of Overwatch from the Pink Horrors, hitting on 6s, getting 1 hit. Wounding on a 5, and it fails to wound. And so here's the charge distance from the Fleshhounds, getting 10 inches. And so here's where their charge ended up. They are over an inch away from this squad of Pink Horrors in the back. So these 2 fully healthy Fleshhounds can choose either to attack the Pink Horrors or Magnus the Red. The wounded Fleshhound at this point can only attack Magnus the Red. So now we will roll for the charge for the Bloodletters onto Magnus. And here's their charge roll, getting 9 inches. And so here's where they ended up, and now everyone's in combat. So now going into the fight phase, we will start with the Bloodletters onto Magnus. So 21 attacks from the Bloodletters onto Magnus, hitting on 3s, getting 15 hits, wounding on 5s, getting 5 wounds, but no double damage. 5 4-up invulnerable saves, and he passes 4 of them. So Magnus will go from 8 wounds left down to 7. And so now the Fleshhounds will attack with 1 attacking Magnus and 2 attacking the Pink Horrors. So the 2 attacking the Pink Horrors, 6 attacks on the charge, hitting on 3s, getting 4 hits, wounding on 3s, getting 3 wounds, 3 4-up invulnerable saves, and they pass 2, failing 1. And so 1 model from the squad will go down, and normally I would want to keep the Iridescent Horror alive because he has more attacks, but there is a chance, since the other model has a demonic icon, that when they take their morale check, they could roll 1 and get D6 models back. So the Iridescent Horror will go down. And so then the final Fleshhound onto Magnus, 3 attacks on the charge, hitting on 3s, getting 2 hits, wounding on 5s, and fails to wound. So now going into units that did not charge this turn, we will start with the Bloodthirster. Only 4 attacks this time since he did not charge and was not charged, using the Mighty Strike. 4 attacks, hitting on 3s, gets 2 hits and no additional hits. Wounding on 2s and gets 2 wounds. 2 4-up invulnerable saves and passes 1. So rolling the 2 dice and taking the highest for d6 damage, and it only does 2 damage. Only doing 2 damage. Which means that Magnus will still be alive with 5 wounds left. So now Kairos Fateweaver is going to attack the Bloodletters. And Kairos Fateweaver still has 9 wounds left, which means he's still at his highest tier on his damage chart, so he has 5 attacks base, and he still has the +1 attack from the Boon of Change, because that won't go away until the start of the next Tzeentch Psychic phase. And since this is the Chaos Demon's turn, he still gets that, so 6 attacks total with the Staff of Tomorrow onto the Bloodletters. Hitting on 3s, getting 5 hits. Wounding on 2s, getting 4 wounds. 4 5-up invulnerable saves, and they pass 2, failing 2. And so 2 Bloodletters will go down, leaving 3 Bloodletters left, and now those Bloodletters will get to strike back. Only 4 attacks back, hitting on 3s, getting 3 hits. Wounding on 5s, and failing to wound. And so now the 1 Pink Horror will strike back against the Fleshhounds. 1 attack, hitting on a 4, and it hits, wounding on a 5, and it fails to wound. So finally, Magnus, with his 5 wounds left, will get to attack last. And since he has 5 wounds left, he still has 6 attacks base, and he will place all 6 onto the Bloodthirster. Hitting on 2s, rerolling 1s, getting 5 hits and 1 reroll. And here's the reroll. Still failing to hit, of course. So, wounding on 2s, getting 4 wounds. 4 5-up invulnerable saves. The Bloodthirster has to pass 3 of these or he is dead. And he fails all 4. So he is crushed, taking 12 damage. And so with only 5 wounds left, this Bloodthirster is removed. So, going into the morale phase, this unit of Bloodletters did lose 2 models this turn, and so they could fail their morale check if they rolled a 6. And so here's the roll, and they pass the morale check. And so now this squad with the pink horrors is the only other squad that lost models this turn. And so they will have to take a morale check. They lost 3 models this turn. So if they roll a 5 or a 6, the final model is removed. However, if they roll a 1, they get D6 models back. So here's the morale check. They roll a 3. So the final pink horror stays alive, but no models are returned. So, taking a look at the tactical objective cards, the Chaos Demons of Khorne failed to scour the skies. They failed to finish defending Objective 6, but they did complete Supremacy. So that will give them D3 victory points. And so here's the roll for that, and they get 3 victory points. And so then the Chaos Demons of Khorne will hold on to Scour the Skies, but they will throw away Defend Objective 6. And so, at the end of Chaos Demons of Khorne turn 3, the score currently sits at 6 victory points for the Chaos Demons of Khorne and 3 victory points for Tzeentch. So going into Tzeentch turn 3, they are still holding on to overwhelming firepower and defend objective 3 from the previous turns. And objective marker 3 is this one back here, currently being held by a skull cannon. And so Tzeentch needed to draw 1 new tactical objective card, and they draw the Dominion of Chaos. Score D3 victory points if you control more objective markers than your opponent at the end of this turn. So going into the movement phase, this squad of pink horrors will remain still. This pink horror is going to fall back out of combat up to 6 inches, and it will fall back to here so that it's out of combat. This pink horror squad is going to remain still. Magnus the Red is going to fall back out of combat over to here about 14 inches, and he will fall back to here. And Kairos Fateweaver is going to fall back out of combat 12 inches over to here, and Kairos will finish his movement here. So going into the psychic phase, the first power that Tzeentch will attempt to manifest will be Kairos attempting to manifest Infernal Gateway onto these bloodletters because they're the only unit within 12 inches. An Infernal Gateway is a warp charge of 8, and it fails with a 7. So now Kairos Fateweaver is going to attempt to cast Smite onto the bloodletters. Needing a 5 up, gets it with a 6. So now the Fleshhounds will attempt to deny the witch, and they fail with a 5. So this will do D3 mortal wounds, and it'll do 3 mortal wounds. And this means that the final 3 bloodletters in the squad are removed. So finally, Kairos Fateweaver will attempt to cast Bolt of Change onto the Fleshhounds as they are within 18 inches. So needing an 8 or higher, and gets it with an 8. And this will cause D3 mortal wounds, and it'll cause 3 mortal wounds. So this will mean the 1 wounded Fleshhound and 1 fully healthy Fleshhound will be killed off. So now Magnus the Red will attempt to cast Smite into the bloodletters, needing at least a 5, and he gets it with a 7, because he still has +1 to his psychic test bonus. And this will do D6 damage thanks to Gaze of Magnus, and it only does 2 mortal wounds. So 2 bloodletters will go down. And now Magnus will cast Death Hex onto those bloodletters. It has a warp charge value of 8, and he gets it with an 8. So the bloodletters cannot take invulns this turn. So now, this lone pink horror is going to attempt to cast Smite into the Fleshhound, looking for a 5 or 6, and fails to get it. And now this squad of pink horrors will attempt to cast Smite into the Fleshhound, looking for a 5 or 6, fails with another 3. And so then finally, this squad of pink horrors will attempt to cast Smite into the Fleshhound, looking for a 5 or 6, and fails again. You know, one of those should have passed. One of those should have passed. Statistically, one of those should have rolled a 5 or 6. So now moving into the shooting phase, this squad of pink horrors is going to shoot the bloodletters. 20 shots, hitting on 4s. And that's a lot of misses. Getting 6 hits out of 20 attacks. Wounding on 4s, getting 3 wounds. No AP, so 3 6-up armor saves. Passes 1 and fails 2. And so 2 bloodletters will go down. And so now the other squad of pink horrors will shoot the 6 remaining bloodletters. 20 attacks again, hitting on 4s, getting 9 hits this time out of 20 attacks. Wounding on 4s, and getting 5 wounds. 5 6-up armor saves, failing 4, passing 1. So 4 more bloodletters will go down. leaving just one Bloodletter and the Blood Reaper. So now going into the assault phase, both squads of Pink Horrors are going to declare a charge onto the lone Fleshhound. Starting with this squad, since it is not charging through a crater and it is closer. And here's their charge distance, getting 10 inches. And because they got 10 inches, that means that they were able to completely surround the lone Fleshhound, which means the other squad actually can't make it into within an inch of the Fleshhound, so they will not be able to charge. So it will be just this squad. So going into the fight phase, they have 11 attacks, hitting on 4s, getting 4 hits, wounding on 5s, getting 1 wound. 1 5-up invulnerable save, which fails. So the Fleshhound will go down to 1 wound. So now the Fleshhound attacks back, 3 attacks, hitting on 3s, getting 3 hits. Wounding on 3s, getting 1 wound. 1 4-up invulnerable save, which fails. And so 1 regular Pink Horror will go down. And so now going into the morale phase, the unit of Pink Horrors in combat only lost 1 model, and they do not have the banner, or the demonic icon. The demonic icon is part of a different squad, so they cannot get models back by rolling a 1, and they cannot fail their morale check since they only lost 1 model, so they will not take a morale check. However, the Fleshhound did lose 2 models this turn, and so if they roll a 6, they could fail. So here's their morale check, and they pass. And then finally, this squad of Bloodletters. They lost 8 models this turn, and so since they have a leadership of 7, not only is it impossible for them to pass the morale check, but even with rolling a 1, they would still fail by 2, which means the final 2 models are just automatically removed. So taking a look at the tactical objective cards, they failed to complete the Dominion of Chaos, as currently Tzeentch is holding 0 objective markers and Khorne is holding 2. So they failed Dominion of Chaos. Because those 2 Bloodletters decided to stay alive and not die off till the morale phase, they failed Overwhelming Firepower, and Objective 3 is being held by a Skull Cannon, so they have failed to defend Objective 3. And at this point, because of the fact that if Tzeentch was somehow able to successfully defend Objective 3, that would mean Khorne would have to pretty much be tabled. They will throw defend Objective 3 away. And so at the end of Tzeentch turn 3, the score currently sits at 3 victory points for Tzeentch and 6 victory points for the Chaos Demons of Khorne. So going into Chaos Demons of Khorne, turn 4, Khorne is still holding on to Scour the Skies from the previous turn, and they also drew 2 new tactical objective cards, and they drew the Glory of Khorne. Score 1 victory point if an enemy character was destroyed during this turn. If an enemy character was destroyed by one of your Khorne demon units during this turn, score D3 victory points instead. And the Great Game. Roll a dice at the end of each turn after generating this objective. Score that number of victory points if you control exactly that number of objective markers. For example, if you roll a 3, you will score 3 victory points if you control 3 objective markers. Going into the movement phase, it's going to be a pretty quick and easy movement phase this turn, as this Fleshhound will remain locked in combat, these 2 Skull Cannons will remain still, and this Skull Cannon will remain still. So now going into the shooting phase, starting with this Skull Cannon, which can see Kairos Fateweaver, will shoot Kairos Fateweaver through the window of this ruin. So D6 shots, getting 1 shot, of course. Hitting on a 3, and it hits. Wounding on a 3, and it wounds. Minus 2 AP, so Kairos will have his 4-up invuln, which he passes. So now this Skull Cannon will shoot Kairos Fateweaver. D6 shots, getting 5 shots. Hitting on 3s, getting 3 hits. Wounding on 3s, getting only 1 wound. 1 4-up invulnerable save, which fails. So we'll do D3 damage, doing 1 damage. So Kairos Fateweaver will drop from 9 wounds remaining down to 8. And so finally then this Skull Cannon will also shoot Kairos Fateweaver. D6 shots, getting 3 shots. Hitting on 3s, getting 3 hits. Wounding on 3s, getting 3 wounds, 3 4-up invulnerable saves, and passes all 3, of course. So going into the assault phase, there are no charges to declare, and so we will go right into the fight phase between the Fleshhound and the Pink Horrors. 2 attacks from the Fleshhound, hitting on 3s, wounding on 3s, getting 1 wound. 1 4-up invulnerable save, which fails. And so 1 pink horror will go down. 9 attacks back, hitting on 4s, getting 3 hits. Wounding on 5s, getting 1 wound. 1 5-up invulnerable save, which fails. And so the final wound on this Fleshhound is removed, and so the Fleshhound is killed off. And so then, after consolidating a little bit, going into the morale phase, this unit of pink horrors did lose 1 model, but it is impossible for them to fail a morale check after losing 1 model. So now taking a look at the tactical objective cards, Chaos Demons of Khorne failed to scour the skies, they failed to achieve the glory of Khorne, and we will roll a dice for the great game. Khorne holds 2 objectives, they are looking for a 2, and they get the 2. So they get 2 objectives, 2 victory points for that objective card. And because Scour the Skies and the Glory of Khorne kind of go together at this point, since the only Tzeentch characters are also flying characters, so they will achieve both cards by killing a single Tzeentch character, they will hold on to both. And so, at the end of Chaos Demons of Khorne turn 4, the score currently sits at 8 victory points for the Chaos Demons of Khorne and 3 victory points for Tzeentch. So going into Tzeentch turn 4, Tzeentch is still holding on to the Dominion of Chaos and overwhelming firepower from the previous turn. And so the new tactical objective card that they draw this turn is Touched by the Warp. Score 1 victory point if you manifested or denied a psychic power during this turn. If you manifested or denied a psychic power with a Tzeentch demon unit during this turn, score D3 victory points instead. Well, that should be pretty easy to achieve. And so going into the movement phase, we will start with Kairos Fateweaver, who is now down to 8 wounds, and he will move 8 inches up the board. And now Magnus the Red, since he still has 5 wounds left, will move 14 inches up the board. And so Magnus the Red will end up right here. Now this unit of Pink Horrors is going to move up to Objective Marker 1, and they will also declare an advance. And here's the advance roll, getting an additional 5 inches. And so after their 11 inches of total movement, the Pink Horrors will end up right here, securely holding Objective Marker 1. Now this lone Pink Horror is going to move, and he will also declare an advance. And here's the advance roll, getting an additional 5 inches as well for 11 inches of total movement. And so 11 inches of movement was enough to put him here within 3 inches of the center of Objective Marker 6. This squad of Pink Horrors will remain still. So now going into the Psychic phase, Kairos Fateweaver is going to cast Smite and Bolt of Change onto this Skull Cannon, and he will also cast Gaze of Fate. So starting with Gaze of Fate, which has a warp charge value of 6, and he gets it with the 12. So Tzeentch will be able to reroll 1 dice roll later this turn. Now for Smite onto the Skull Cannon, and he gets it with a 7. So D3 mortal wounds, doing 3 mortal wounds, and all the Fleshhounds are dead, so there is no Deny the Witch tests for Khorne to take. And so that will drop the Skull Cannon from 7 starting wounds down to 4. And actually, instead of Bolt of Change, Kairos of Fateweaver will cast Infernal Gateway, because there is the chance for it to do D6 mortal wounds instead of D3. And the Skull Cannon is definitely within 12 inches, so either would be able to target it. So here's the dice roll, needing an 8, and fails with a 7. Either way, it would have failed. Next, this Pink Horror squad, which has 8 models, is just within 18 inches of this Skull Cannon. So they will attempt to cast Smite onto the Skull Cannon. Looking for a 5 or 6, and they get the 5. But now that they're down to 8 models, it only does 1 mortal wound. However, Tzeentch will take it, because I think that's the first time this game that a Pink Horror squad has successfully manifested Smite. And so this Skull Cannon will go from 7 wounds down to 6. And now Magnus will attempt to cast Smite onto the same Skull Cannon. So here's the Psychic test, and he gets it with the 7. And because of the Gaze of Magnus, this will do D6 mortal wounds, and it will do 6 mortal wounds, which means that this Skull Cannon is just killed off from Smite. And so now Magnus will cast Warp Time onto himself. Warp Time is a warp charge value of 6, and he gets it with the 10, which means Magnus is able to move as if it were the movement phase again, 14 inches. And Magnus will finish his movement here, just over an inch away from this Skull Cannon. And so then finally, for the third power that Magnus will cast Death Hex onto this Skull Cannon. Death Hex has a warp charge value of 8, and he fails with a 4, so Death Hex will not go off. So now that the psychic phase is over, there are no targets in the shooting phase, so we will go straight into the assault phase, and there are 2 charges to declare. First of which is Magnus declaring a charge into the Skull Cannon, and the second will be Kairos Fateweaver declaring a charge into that Skull Cannon. And so we will start with Magnus charging into the Skull Cannon, and the Skull Cannon will have Overwatch. D6 shots, getting 1 shot, hitting on a 6 and fails to hit. 2d6 charge distance and makes it with a 9. Since Magnus is charging through a crater, a double 1 would have automatically failed. So he actually has 7 inches of charge, but that is definitely more than enough to make it in. And so now Kairos is charged, Overwatch from the Skull Cannon first, d6 shots, getting 2 shots, hitting on 6s, getting 1 hit, wounding on a 3, and it wounds. 1 4-up invulnerable save, which passes. And so now his charge distance, getting 5 inches, and 5 inches will not make it in. Kairos is about 6 3/4 inches away from the Skull Cannon, which means it needs a 6-inch charge, which means since he's going through a crater, he needs to roll an 8 or higher in order to make it in. And so, Tzeentch will use their 1 reroll, thanks to Gaze of Fate, in order to reroll the 2, and they are really hoping for a 5 or a 6. And they get the 5, so they make it into combat. And so now Kairos Fateweaver is in combat with the Skull Cannon. So let's resolve Kairos Fateweaver first. Kairos is down to 8 wounds, so he only has 3 attacks base with his Staff of Tomorrow, hitting on 3s, getting 3 hits. Wounding on 3s, getting 2 wounds. 2 5-up invulnerable saves, and they fail both. And this does d6 damage apiece, and it does exactly 4 damage. Which means that this Skull Cannon is killed off. And Kairos will not consolidate. And so now the final combat of this turn, and possibly the last combat of the game, the biggest fight you've ever seen in your life, Magnus the Red versus a Skull Cannon. Magnus the Red still has 5 wounds left, so he has 6 attacks base, using the Blade of Magnus, all 6 going onto the Skull Cannon, hitting on 2s, re-rolling 1s, and getting 4 hits to start. And here's the re-rolls, getting 6 hits. Strength 16 versus Toughness 7 is 2s to wound, getting 5 wounds. 5 5-up invulnerable saves. And the Skull Cannon passes 3 of them, which means he survives with 1 wound left, because they are only 3 damage apiece. And so this Skull Cannon will go from 7 starting wounds down to 1 left. So Khorne will not be tabled this turn. And in fact, the Skull Cannon does get to fight back. The Skull Cannon has 2 attacks base, plus 1 for being charged. Hitting on 3s, of course only getting 1 hit. Wounding on a 5, and fails to wound. So going into the morale phase, there are no morale tests to take. So taking a look at the tactical objective cards, Tzeentch failed to complete overwhelming firepower, because unfortunately, Smite doesn't count as a shooting attack, and so they will throw overwhelming firepower away. The Dominion of Chaos score D3 victory points if you control more objective markers than your opponent at the end of the turn. And thanks to the 2 Skull Cannons that died, and Magnus and Kairos being where they currently are, they actually hold 4 objective markers now, and Khorne holds 0. So they do definitely complete the Dominion of Chaos. And it is worth D3 victory points, worth only 1. And then Touched by the Warp, score 1 victory point if you manifested or denied a psychic power during this turn. If you manifested or denied a psychic power with a Tzeentch demon unit during this turn, score D3 victory points instead. And they did successfully do that. And it was a Tzeentch demon unit, so D3 victory points for that, which will give them 3. And so at the end of Tzeentch turn 4, the score currently sits at 7 victory points for Tzeentch and 8 victory points for the Chaos Demons of Khorne. So, going into the Chaos Demons of Khorne, turn 5. They are still holding on to Scour the Skies and the Glory of Khorne from the previous turn. And they draw Overwhelming Firepower. Score 1 victory point if an enemy unit was destroyed during the shooting phase of your turn. If 3 or more enemy units were destroyed during the shooting phase of your turn, score D3 victory points instead. And with that, Khorne is going to concede this game, since all they have left is a single skull cannon with a single wound, which is locked in combat with Magnus the Red. And so we will have a Khorne concession and a Tzeentch victory. And so this does mean that now that the game is over, Tzeentch will get Linebreaker thanks to Kairos Fateweaver and Magnus, and so we have a Tzeentch victory thanks to concession, but the final score in victory points, in case anyone was wondering, is 8 victory points for Tzeentch thanks to getting Linebreaker at the end, and 8 victory points for the Chaos Demons of Khorne. And so the victory points are tied, but we have a Tzeentch victory thanks to a concession. And so now that the game is over and Tzeentch has been announced the winner, I can talk quickly about how I thought the game went. Overall, I have to admit, I thought that was a pretty amazing game with how much back and forth there was the entire game and how close it was for the longest time. The fact that Magnus was brought down to 5 wounds and then managed to survive so much longer than he probably should have. I think he survived 2 full turns at only 5 wounds because he fell back out of combat with the Bloodletters and with the Fleshhounds, and then just stood next to a ruin for a full turn, and then moved over here and didn't take any more damage against the Skull Cannon. I mean, it's just incredible. The fact that the Skull Cannon managed to survive with 1 wound left. I knew that failing Death Hex a second time was going to cause problems. It caused problems both times. Both times when Magnus failed to cast Death Hex, the enemy ended up surviving because Death Hex not going off, he did enough damage to kill off the unit, but because Death Hex did not go off, the enemy was able to save enough, they were able to pass enough invulnerable saves in order to stay alive. The Bloodthirster passed 2 invulns to not take any damage, and then the Skull Cannon passed 3 out of 5 5-up invulns in order to not die off. He only had to fail 3, but instead he passed 3. It's not even like all 5 needed to go through, or even 4 of the 5. No, just 3 had to get passed, which statistically should happen. Statistically should fail 3 out of 5 5-up invulns, but he passes 3 of them to stay alive. What a champ. And then, of course, the fact that he was charged that turn meant he had 3 attacks back onto Magnus. Had all 3 hit, had all 3 wounded with rolls of 6s. All 3 would have done double damage, and had Magnus failed 3 invulns doing double damage, that Skull Cannon actually could have finished off Magnus, which would have been incredible to see. And while very unlikely that Tzeentch would not table Khorne in Tzeentch turn 5, it would have at least given Khorne a better chance to possibly be able to stay alive. Especially now that Kairos is down to 8 wounds, he only has an 8-inch movement, so if the Skull Cannon stays still, Kairos most likely is not able to get into close combat with him, which means really then it's up to psychic powers and shooting attacks from the pink horrors in order to try to bring him down. And I don't know that that's very likely, considering the pink horrors would only be wounding on 6s. They definitely wouldn't be able to charge this turn. They'd be able to shoot, but they wouldn't be able to charge in the Tzeentch turn 5. So, it really came down to that final combat, although at the same time, the Skull Cannon survived, but like I said, if it fails 1 more invuln, then that Skull Cannon dies and Tzeentch outright wins with a tabling. So it was close all the way down to the end. And then of course withdrawing Overwhelming Firepower, there's still that 1 pink horror with the demonic icon all alone. And he's definitely within 48-inch range, so the Skull Cannon possibly could have killed off that 1 pink horror to secure Overwhelming Firepower. And so then, Khorne, even with Linebreaker on Tzeentch's side, Khorne would still be winning 9-8. And so unless Tzeentch is able to table Khorne, or able to get 1 more victory point from a tactical objective card, and they would be drawing 3 new ones, so who knows what they would draw, possibly 3 horrible tactical objective cards that are impossible to achieve. It's entirely possible, had that Skull Cannon somehow managed to come back and scratch off the final 5 wounds on Magnus, it's possible Khorne actually still would have won this game with a single Skull Cannon with a single wound. So that's just amazing to me. That blows my mind. It was incredibly fun to play. I really hope it was fun to watch. I mean, there was some crazy dice rolls going on, some crazy attacks. I think this has got to be the most nail-bitiest battle report that I've filmed so far. I mean, this really came down to the wire. This really came down to the wire. And the fact that it ended up tied 8 victory points apiece thanks to Linebreaker, that just shows how close it was. It might not look overly close considering the fact that Tzeentch has 5 units on the table still, including 1 full squad of pink horrors, but it's close. With the way that it ended up, with where the units currently are on the table, it was close because, like I said, a couple dice rolls away from either Khorne being tabled or Khorne being able to kill off Magnus and win the game that way. Also, the other thing though is Khorne didn't even have to finish off Magnus in Tzeentch turn 4. If the Skull Cannon had simply taken a wound or 2 off of Magnus, Khorne then would still have a chance this fight phase in Khorne turn 5 to finish off Magnus in close combat, because if he knocks a wound off of Magnus in Tzeentch turn 4, then Magnus is down to 4 wounds, and therefore would still be able to get 2 hits, 2 wound rolls of 6s, which do double damage, which could potentially kill Magnus off. And then, of course, if the Skull Cannon kills Magnus off in Khorne turn 5, they then complete Scour the Skies and Glory of Khorne, which is worth way more victory points than killing 1 pink horror for overwhelming firepower. So, I mean, actually, it was really close, because even just doing 1 wound to Magnus last turn, I would then want to see this turn all the way through. But the fact that he didn't means it is impossible for him to kill Magnus this turn, which means 1, Magnus is pretty much guaranteed. Well, okay, he's not guaranteed, but he has a very good chance of killing Khorne, the Skull Cannon, this turn. But even if Magnus does not kill the Skull Cannon this turn, at worst, they're still locked in combat together, which means in Tzeentch turn 5, Magnus can just smite the Skull Cannon to death. He can retry Death Hex, and he can activate Diabolic Strength, attempt to manifest Diabolic Strength on himself to give himself an extra attack. And so, most unless the Skull Cannon somehow killed off Magnus, Khorne would be tabled by the end of Tzeentch turn 5 before we even roll to see if the game is over. So Khorne would be tabled unless they could kill off Magnus. So, but that's crazy that's what it came down to, was whether or not they could finish off the 5 wounds on Magnus. That really determined whether or not the game would have a chance for Khorne. Because of course, if Magnus survives, not only is it impossible for the Skull Cannon to kill Magnus in close combat, meaning he can't get Glory of Khorne and Scour the Skies from that, but if he falls back, he then can't shoot anyways. And so he sort of has to stay locked in combat then, which is why he needed to take at least 1 wound off of that. So anyways, that's enough of me rambling. I really hope you enjoyed this game, as I really enjoyed playing it. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next one.